experiment was known to go haywire when the dish rotated. He later noted that during the filming of the Dark Files, proof was recovered that a network of tunnels existed beneath Camp Hero, connecting all of its structures. He told Newsday in 2017, "Something extraordinary was found, which goes against all the official statements that there isn't anything there. We didn't get into them." Now we all know what Stranger Things is. But what some of you may not know is that the series was partially inspired by several real-life cases and conspiracy theories. And with the launch of the final season, we thought there would be no better time to examine the disturbing true story Stranger Things is. Stranger Things. But what some of you may not know, as always, is that the series was partially inspired by several real-life cases and conspiracy theories. Now first we're going to take a look at the final season. Montauk Project. We thought there would be no better time to examine the disturbing true story Stranger Things as a result of a book written by Preston Nichols, as always, is that the series was partially inspired by several real-life cases and conspiracy. Both men claim to have recovered repressed memories of their involvement in the conspiracy that disturbing true story took place in the US Air Force base in Preston Nichols, as always, is that the series was partially inspired by several real-life cases and according to the area's history. The camp was commissioned in May 1982 by the US Army in defense of the disturbing true story took place in the US Air Force base in South as always, is that the series was partially inspired by several real-life cases and according to the area's history. In order to deceive commissioned in May 1982 by the US Army in defense of the structure remains today. Many of the small closed-cell houses have been worn over. The base was deactivated in 1947, several years after the camp was commissioned in May 1982. The US Air Force in 1982. The structure was shut down in 1982 until the closed-cell houses have been worn. Nichols' base was deactivated in 1967, several years after the camp was commissioned in 1982. 70 US Air Force ground environment radar towers. The structure was shut down in 1982. Project Montauk is set out as another alleged experiment. Nichols' Philadelphia experiment, which supposedly took 6 decades earlier in 1943. The Philadelphia experiment was apparently an attempt by the US Navy to make a specific ship of theirs highly invisible cell devices. The ship in question was the USS Hellsbeck, a destroyer escort that operated during the Second World War. According to the story, the experiment was somewhat successful. But doing so caused the question to become Hellsbeck physically, a destroyer escort that operated during the Montauk Project conspiracy. Alleged the Philadelphia experiment was somewhat paved the way for the more advanced investigations at Camp Hero, and that those who'd worked on previous experiments continued their work in Montauk. Some of those abducted and forced into experimentation at Camp Hero alleged the Philadelphia experiment was somewhat paved the way for the more advanced investigations at Camp Hero tests, and that those who pertain to space-time manipulation, the goal was to control the minds of these impressionable mortals in order to create super soldiers. One of the most famous of the devices used in the experiment was the Montauk Chair of different tests, which was supposedly designed to enhance one's psychic ability and allow the user to harness such powers and insert influence or view events across time and space. Such experiments were able to experience different time tests, which was subtracted by past and future selves. Stranger Things allows able to recover their powers in later seasons using a similar device. Mind control is another experiment subject to research time tests, which was subtracted by past, which is said to have examined the depths of psychological warfare, including looking at brainwashing techniques, remote influence, and the programming of the human mind. Mind control is another experiment Nichols and Barry research claimed that such programming was carried out by means of electromagnetic radiation, which was often done on members of the unhoused population who were abducted from the streets to be used as experimental fodder. Employees at Camp Hero would transmit ideas and programs carried out by using electromagnetic radiation, who were also capable of inducing hallucinations or controlling one's actions and thoughts without their knowledge to be used as experimental. Other research conducted by the project was interdimensional and extraterrestrial contact. In 1951, Doles reportedly became interested in Project, reached out to a senior officer working on the program. He explained his intrigue in exploring, augmenting the usual interrogation methods by the use of drugs, hypnosis, shock, etc. In 1951, led the CIA to begin opening secret prisons in West Germany, the Philippines, to a senior officer working on the prisoners were subject to unethical experimentation with no oversight, augmenting the usual interrogation methods by the use of drugs, hypnosis, shock, or simply labeled expendable. In 1951, led the CIA to begin opening secret prisons in West Germany, the Philippines, to a senior officer working on the prisoners were subject to unethical experimentation with no oversight, augmenting the usual interrogation methods by the use of drugs, hypnosis, shock, or simply labeled expendable. In 1951, led the CIA also began advising secret prisons in West Germany, after he was brought to the US as part of Operation Unethical Experimentation, where 1,600 German engineers, scientists, and technicians by the use of drugs, organized party officials were brought into the country. In 1951, Schreiber had approved several abuses in human experiments in various Nazi concentration camps during the war. In some ways, the project was an extension of work that had started in such concentration camps. As well as Schreiber, several other German vivisectionists and researchers were brought in to explain what they'd found during their human experiments that it could be built upon by the CIA during MK Ultra. Now just a quick side note before we carry on. Such concentration camps. As well as Schreiber, several other German vivisectionists and researchers were brought in to explain what they'd found during their human experiments that it could be during MK Ultra project. Now just a quick side note before we carry on. Such concentration camps. As well as Schreiber, several other German vivisectionists and researchers were brought in to explain what they'd found during their human experiments that it could be during MK Ultra project. Now just a quick side note before we carry on. Such concentration camps. As well as Schreiber, several other German vivisectionists and researchers were brought in to explain what they'd found. 53, it would be renamed again, this time to MK Ultra, signifying its ultra-sensitive nature. One of the first tasks that the project set out to do was to establish a potential truth serum, which they hoped would also be able to reprogram subjects and wipe them out again, this time to MK Ultra. One journalist who spent several years researching the project, Stephen Kinzer, described the theory as false. Tasks that the project set Gottlieb wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds, which they realized it was a two-part process. First, you had to blast away the existing mind. Second, you had to find a way to insert a new mind into that resulting void. We didn't get too far on number 2, but he did a lot of work on number 1. The CIA's top drug expert was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, who was to oversee the research into such a substance, and he quickly discovered that numerous drugs had been tried before in previous government experiments, including heroin, cocaine, and mescaline, a naturally occurring psychedelic proto-alkaloid known for its hallucinogenic effects. Notably, the CIA learned of the use of mescaline from Nazi doctors who had used the substance at concentration camps while carrying out human experiments. Those doctors were brought in to advise the CIA of its effects. Poison gases like sarin were also explored by the CIA, and again, Nazi doctors were able to provide them with a wealth of information on such substances. In 1953, Gottlieb decided to try out LSD and arranged for the CIA to spend $240,000, almost $3 million in today's money, on purchasing a massive supply of the drug. Pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly and Company, the first company to mass-produce both the polio vaccine and insulin, was approached a short time later to replicate the formula, so that the CIA would have access to an endless supply of it. The drug was subsequently distributed to the healthcare facilities, including hospitals, local clinics, and other such institutions, asking them to give it to patients and record their reactions. Gottlieb did this through fabricated foundations, so that the CIA could avoid detection and thus not be linked back to the government. As well as being distributed amongst healthcare patients, the drug was also given to prisoners, those with mental illnesses, and people suffering from addiction, with one CIA officer summoning these groups up as people who could not fight back. One such prisoner was the infamous James Whitney Bulger, who would later go on to become the boss of the organized crime group, the Winter Hill Gang. In 1956, Bulger served his first term in federal prison at Atlanta Penitentiary for armed robbery and truck hijacking. He later stated that he and his fellow inmates who participated in the CIA's MKUltra scheme had been duped into doing so, being told that they were helping to find a cure for schizophrenia. He and 18 other inmates volunteered for the program, as they were promised that time would be taken off their sentences, and for 18 months the group were given LSD as well as other drugs. Bulger recalled that this period of his life was nightmarish and took him to the depths of insanity. He wrote in his notebooks that he regularly heard voices and was afraid that he would be locked up for life if anybody were to learn of this. He also noted at one time 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, total loss of appetite, hallucinating. The room would change shape, hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls, guys turning to skeletons in front of me. Kinzer described MKUltra as the most sustained search in history for techniques of mind control. Over the next 10 years, the program continued to expand. It involved at least 80 institutions, 44 educational facilities, and 185 researchers. Because of the massive amount of secrecy shrouding the project, however, many agency leaders remained in the dark about its existence, and this helped Gottlieb's ideas and experiments go largely unchecked. Prisoners from not just inside the US but outside it too were brought in to be experimented on, tortured and abused, and since he never had to formally report on his work, the things he got up to were not well documented. Kinzer stated, "We do not know how many people died, but a number did, and many lives were permanently destroyed." He added, "This guy had a license to kill. He was allowed to requisition human subjects across the United States and around the world and subject them to any kind of abuse that he wanted, even up to the level of it being fatal. Yet nobody looked over his shoulder." By the early 1960s, Lieb was beginning to grow tired of the project, since nothing that he ever did ever gave Dulles the results he was hoping for. In 1960, he wrote that no effective knockout pill, truth serum, aphrodisiac, or recruitment pill was known to exist. Though he was unable to find the ultimate drug that would give the US the powers that the Soviet Union supposedly harbored, he did learn that a mixture of drugs, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and other such methods of abuse would help to break the human mind. The project wound down in 1963, and in 1964 it was replaced with MK Search, said to be a tamer version of its predecessor. Gottlieb's career came to an end in 1973, 20 years after MKUltra began, when his boss, Richard Helms, the then director of the CIA, was removed from his position by President Richard Nixon. Helms was reportedly the only person at the agency who had any real idea about what exactly Gottlieb had been getting up to, and so they both agreed that all records of the project should be destroyed. Gottlieb subsequently drove out to the CIA Records Center and ordered that boxes full of recorded information be destroyed, but fortunately records were found in other places, meaning that there was enough for future individuals to piece together just what exactly Gottlieb had been putting his subjects through. Kinzer told the Allied Review of Books, "Gottlieb was a terrible scientist. His experiments were not conducted with scientific rigor. Many of the people that he had as operatives carrying out these experiments abroad didn't speak foreign languages. They were not trained in psychology." Another prominent figure of the MKUltra project was Donald Owen Cameron, a Scottish-born psychiatrist, known for his unethical medical experiments and development of psychological and medical torture techniques regarded in his field, and during the 1960s became president of the World Psychiatric Association. In the 1950s, his work attracted the interest of the CIA, and they began to fund it under MKUltra Sub-Project 68. Cameron hoped to correct schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. He worked mostly at the McGill's Allen Memorial Institute, or the Allen for short, in Montreal, making the commute from Lake Placid, New York every week, and was paid $69,000 over a span of 7 years between 1957 and 1964 by the CIA, the modern-day equivalent of over $837,000. His series of experiments was known simply as the Montreal experiments. As well as experimenting with LSD, he also tried out various paralytic drugs, such as Cure. and put his patients through electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times the advised power. Cameron was also known to put patients into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time, as many as 3 months even, and play recordings of noises or simple statements on a loop. These experiments, referred to as psychic driving experiments, were often carried out on patients suffering from common mental health issues like anxiety disorders or postnatal depression. A large number of these patients were left permanently debilitated following such treatments, as they became incontinent, suffered amnesia, forgot how to talk, forgot who their family members were, and some even believed that hospital employees were their parents. One of Cameron's most well-documented patients was that of Esther Schreier, whose story was covered by a CBC podcast named Brainwashed, co-produced with the Fifth Estate. Esther had a tough time growing up. Born in 1932, she was just 4 when her father died, and just over a year later, her mother was diagnosed with a brain tumor. She was subsequently given a lobotomy, which left her unable to care for herself, never mind her children, and she was committed to a psychiatric facility while Esther and her brother were placed into care, where they were bounced around various relatives and foster homes. As a young adult, Esther trained as a nurse and took up a position at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. She eventually met Haskell Schreier on a blind date, and the pair married in 1955. In 1958, she gave birth to the couple's first child, a girl they named Lynn Carroll, but the baby died at just 3 weeks old, and Esther plunged into a never-ending grief. She felt an immense amount of guilt for her baby's death, and struggled with it still in 1960 when she became pregnant again. Around this time, her husband learned of Ewan Cameron and his distinguished reputation at the Allen, and wondered if it was a suitable place for Esther to receive treatment. In February of 1960, Esther entered the facility with her family, believing that she would receive the best care that money could buy. In her records, part of the reasoning for her admittance was her anxiety around her second pregnancy. Despite the reputation of both Cameron and the hospital, however, her medical records would later reveal that she was severely abused and neglected while in the facility's care. She was placed into a drug-induced coma for 30 days, and roused 3 times a day for feedings and bathroom breaks. She lost 13 pounds in 4 weeks, and when she was finally fully brought out of the coma, she couldn't stand because she was so weak. Esther was put through a technique called depatterning, which Cameron believed would break down a patient's mind to a childlike state using ECT and drugs. This would then allow the patient to start over, and he could reprogram the brain. This is where the psychic driving technique would come in, where a tape loop would be played over and over again. These messages were sometimes played through headphones or speakers, but could be installed into a patient's pillow. Subjects would have to listen to the messages as many as 500,000 times. By March 12th, Esther was considered completely depatterned. She was mute, incontinent, and had difficulty swallowing. Her son Lloyd later recalled that his mother did not recognize her husband, his father, afterwards, and that she had once told him that she'd forgotten how to boil water. On several occasions, while being subjected to the so-called treatment, an obstetrician had to be brought in after she began bleeding. She would be allowed to rest for 4 to 5 days before the experiments resumed. By August 1960, 6 months after entering the facility, she had suffered through 29 ECT treatments. According to her records, the majority of these used an extreme level of power. The experiment stopped at this time supposedly because she was in her 8th month of pregnancy. Her son Lloyd was born on September 27, 1960. She was able to live a fairly normal life, but not without a lot of time, effort, and support from her family. She died in 2017 at the age of 84 from cancer. Now, Esther is said to be one of the lucky ones in some ways, as many patients that left the Allen were unable to go back to the lives they once lived, causing multi-generational trauma. Some had their children taken into foster care, others had their lives demolished by divorce. Canadian social activist and writer Naomi Klein wrote in her book, The Shock Doctrine, that Ewan Cameron's research and contribution to MKUltra were not all about mind control and brainwashing, but rather it was to design a scientifically based system for extracting information from resistant sources. In other words, torture. Kinzer has made similar statements, noting that in the 1960s, some experiments carried out under MKUltra were detailed in the CIA's QBAG Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, including deprivation of sensory stimuli, threats and fear, pain, hypnosis, and narcosis. Long sections of the material were devoted to the idea of sensory deprivation, which was drawn from a number of experiments at McGill University. The Allen is part of McGill University. In the 1980s, 9 former patients of Cameron sued the CIA. The case was settled out of court in 1988. Esther did not participate in the lawsuit, as she did not want people to learn of her mental health difficulties. Interestingly, the trial exposed that the Canadian government had also been funding Cameron's experiments for an even longer period than the CIA. In 1994, almost 2 decades after the experiments were made public, the Canadian government offered compensation for Cameron's former patients between 1950 and 1965, but they had to prove that they had experienced full or substantial depatterning